friends, I'm Aaron Simmons, and thank you again so much for getting signed up for this newsletter. Last month seemed to be a pretty good success. I've gotten some good feedback. If you have thoughts about these or things you'd like to see in them, please do let me know. I'll be happy to adjust stuff. I'm trying to do these monthly, released on the first day of the month, in order to, encourage us for that month, to think together, to wrestle with some ideas that might be worthwhile, that are relevant to where we find ourselves. So again, thank you so much for subscribing. Thank you so much for supporting the work that I'm doing, trying to bring public philosophy into the mainstream culture to allow us to recognize that philosophy is not an abstract discourse, but really something that helps us think well in order to live well. Well, today, I have been really thinking a lot about what would make sense for this video, this exclusive content. Again, these are meant to be more informal, but a little bit more of a deep dive into some philosophical issues, but yet trying to show that they're expansively applicable, that it really speaks to things in our daily life, and that philosophy is sort of, where we are and not some place that we're trying to go. So I am giving a talk next week about the relation between philosophy and theology. It's for a podcast called The New Evangelicals. I will, of course, be mentioning it on my social media and talking about it once it comes out. So please do make sure to check that out. And so I thought that maybe a cool way to think with you today for this exclusive newsletter video, this bonus content, is to maybe do a kind of dry run of those ideas, because they are, I think, ideas that a lot of us struggle to think through and think critically about, because often philosophy and theology get confused for each other. Sometimes philosophy really just is a kind of disguised theology. Other times theology maybe needs to be more philosophical. So what I want to do is maybe think about how these stand in relation, at least according to what I think is the best way to understand them, give you a few different ways forward, and then some suggestions for other places that you might go if you want to dig a little bit deeper. All right, so ultimately there are two big traditions of understanding philosophy and theology and their relation to each other. The first tradition is, let's call, Anselmian thinking. This comes from Saint Anselm, who was trying to propose the idea that as religious, as theistic, in his case as Christian, part of what it meant to think philosophically was to think about one's Christian commitments and the truth that one knew theologically. It's to think about that in reflective ways. And so famously, Anselm suggests this phrase as a kind of guide for how we think about these things. And he says it in Latin, fides quaerens intellectum. This famously just means faith-seeking understanding. This is, of course, used by all kinds of contemporary apologists, and sometimes it's even used by, youth pastors that are trying to look, pretty sophisticated in their Wednesday night classes. But the idea is simply, we start with faith. We start with this revealed awareness of what is the case because of our religious commitment, and that then, in turn, opens on to a deeper dive, a reflective engagement with what then becomes available via the natural light of reason. So we start with faith, we go into the understanding, and philosophy then is not really radically distinguished from theology. It's just a particular mode of thinking where the understanding is privileged. So for Anselm and those who would maybe defend this broadly Anselmian approach, the difference between philosophy and theology is less interesting than the blurry boundary by which we engage both. So contemporary Anselmian philosophers are those who defend what is popularly known as Christian philosophy. And the idea here, as defended by people like Alvin Plantinga and others, Nick Wolterstorff, they suggest that basically what it is to do Christian philosophy is just to do Anselmian philosophy. It's just to do philosophy from the perspective of our confessional theological commitments. Now, this would blur a boundary between philosophy and theology, because the idea is that the revelational and the rational are two sides of the same coin of truth-seeking. For many people who do contemporary Christian philosophy, the difference between Christian philosophy and Christian theology is, again, not rigid. It's not radical. It's instead a kind of difference of emphasis, a different of tool sets, right? It's not that one group does one thing and the other does the other. It's more about the ways in which we lean into a sort of work relative to argument, the understanding, and a work relative to more digging into the revelational sources by which we then affirm certain things. Okay, so Christian philosophy in this sense, says Alvin Plantinga, is a way of appropriating Anselm's intuition that faith should seek understanding and then do so by being, he says, unapologetic. He talks about Christian boldness and the confidence with which one starts from one's confessional place and then begins to ask philosophical questions about those truth claims that one affirms. Now, importantly, of course, we don't have to think of this only as Christian, right? There could be Islamic philosophy or Jewish philosophy or any other approach that would begin with a revelational content. And so that idea of allowing what I just simply call confessional philosophy is one that has a grand tradition. It has lots of traction in the contemporary debates and has given rise to what contemporarily is often referred to as analytic theology. Analytic theology is basically a branch of analytic philosophy of religion, whereby what they try to do is think really carefully about the truth claims and the commitments that are affirmed within their doctrinal position as a confessional religious person. So it's bringing the tools of analytic philosophy to bear, thinking about things like salvation, soteriology, hamartiology, the role of sin in our lives, what it means to look at ideas such as damnation or punishment, how we make sense of reconciliation. Now, again, those don't have to be understood in a Christian context, but it's this confessional approach. And so analytic theology could be, again, analytic Christian theology, analytic Jewish theology, analytic Muslim theology, etc. All right, well, if Anselm says there is no rigid distinction between philosophy and theology, this gets appropriated more contemporarily by those who basically say, as Nicholas Wolterstorff does, there is no public philosophical reason. There is no space we can stand that is not already indebted to some prior confessional starting point. So why can't we allow those confessional starting points to be religious? It's a perfectly legitimate question. A lot of smart people hold that view and then proceed in that way. I actually think that this is bad strategy, and I'll try to explain why. Well, the alternative view to Anselmian approaches is what we maybe probably should call a Thomistic approach from Thomas Aquinas. And what Aquinas suggests is a reversal of these priorities. It's not that we start with faith and then get to understanding, or start with theology and then use philosophy as a kind of, critical resource for thinking more effectively in our theology. Aquinas suggests that, no, we start with natural reason. We start with doing philosophical work in broadly available ways, such that regardless of our confessional commitments, the arguments that we are doing to begin our thinking are not nested and rooted in revelational content, but rational awareness. This is why he gives what are called cosmological arguments for the existence of God, whereby we start with data and evidence that we can pick up in the world and our experience. And it's something that is shared just because of the human condition and the human sensory capacity, right? We see causation. We see necessity. We see the importance of adjudicating between better and worse things, superlatives. All these different phenomena in the world that we navigate daily actually, he thinks, are natural to all reasonable people. And then when we ask into their condition, what's the source of these things, that's when we open on to something like the possibility and maybe even necessity of a theological turn. Well, I side with Aquinas on this. And here's why. I don't think that he necessarily was right about particular arguments for the existence of God. I'm actually pretty skeptical whether these arguments are the right place to spend a lot of our time. But it's more about the idea that when we start by recognizing a difference between philosophy and theology in pretty robust ways, we don't shut down one or the other, but we instead invite them to work together in ways that enrich both. What do I mean by that? Well, imagine this. If we were to begin exclusively with a confessional set of texts, the Bible, the Quran, whatever it is, what we're doing is necessarily saying only those people who are already a member of this revelational community can access the basic evidence by which we are beginning our inquiry. Let me say that a little bit more accessibly. When we start with an Anselmian approach or a religious philosophical approach where philosophy and theology are porous, it's unclear that we can really differentiate between the evidence available for our different questions, our different ways of thinking. And I think that we should be able to differentiate. So theology, I propose, can and should begin with the immediacy of evidence that is revelationally specific to a confessional community. Alternatively, philosophy should not begin with revelationally specific evidence as immediately available. Instead, philosophy should begin with evidence that is available in principle for all members of the philosophical community, not then subdivided into Christians and Jews and Muslims and atheists and whatever. Now, this is important, I think, because if we're going to make sense of what we do as philosophers, that doesn't mean that we've got to sidestep religious questions or philosophy of religion as a discourse. I'm a philosopher of religion. I think this is a good space to spend one's philosophical energies. But unless we can differentiate between philosophy and theology at the level of evidential authority, what counts as data for us? What can we appeal to without further argumentation, without further supplement? That is, I think, different given the different domains. Philosophers should not be able to appeal to the Bible or the Quran or the Torah as immediately evidential, as immediately data for our arguments. They don't count as premises. Instead, for philosophers, all of this is data at a distance, we might say, right? It's data internal to a hypothetical or a conditional claim. If one is committed to Christianity, if one is committed to the truth of classical theism, if one is identifying as a Jewish or Muslim thinker, in those if statements, we then can introduce that evidence as important for those views within that prior antecedent if. If one is Christian, then enter some biblical reference that allows for some referent to be actually data for us. Philosophers should not move beyond the if when it comes to revelational sources. Instead, philosophers should stick with some broader set of commitments that allow us to recognize all other philosophers as conversation partners, as interlocutors. They are equals in this game, in this praxis. We are all participating in it from the same starting point. Now, it doesn't mean that we all share the same experiences. It doesn't mean that we all share the same background, the same training, the same awareness. We haven't read necessarily the same books. And that's why when I say that philosophy appeals to publicly available evidence in principle that is accessible by all members of the philosophical community, I don't necessarily mean that this is therefore in practice accessible. There's all kinds of reasons that we might have different dispositional oppositions to certain resources or certain evidence sets. But that becomes secondary to the idea that when I engage in public reasoning as a philosopher, I'm not necessarily appealing to evidence that just any person could access, because I'm doing so internal to a discourse that is already professionally and disciplinarily specific. So what I mean by that is it's not revelationally bounded. It's not confessionally bounded. It's philosophically bounded. And that difference is important, I think, at the level of strategy. So when I say philosophers should not do confessional work, that doesn't mean that we don't do personal work, that we don't think really deeply about where we find ourselves. Indeed, my whole YouTube channel is precisely to do that kind of personal philosophical inquiry. I wrestle with questions that are questions for me. But I try in all of my videos, and to be honest, in all of my published work, I try very hard to make sure that I'm never appealing to evidence that wouldn't be accessible by somebody if they didn't agree with me religiously, or if they didn't agree with me morally. Because philosophers can debate about different notions of the good, different approaches to moral life, to political theory, different conceptions of justice. So if I'm going to argue for a particular view of justice, I have to do so with an audience who might start with different conceptions of what justice looks like. But the arguments I'm providing should be evidentially supported in ways that those people with whom I disagree can access my arguments and then engage me, give me objections, critique the things I've claimed, or maybe even have their views transformed in light of the arguments that I've presented as plausible. If we go down the road toward theology, if philosophers go down that road, the worry is not that they would now not be doing philosophy, because what philosophy is itself a contingent practice with a particular history. It's something that has emerged because people got together and said, let's call this philosophy. So I have no objection to Christian philosophy in a Plantinga-style mode being philosophy in some absolute way. I just don't think there's an absolute thing that philosophy is. Instead, my objection is that when we allow philosophy to look the way Plantinga advocates in this Anselmian general mode, we tend to narrow the conversation partners within the philosophical community way too early. There's all kinds of reasons why, as we get deeper into debates and sub-disciplines and sub-discourses and specific fields, that some philosophers, though they might be really invested in some other area, just kind of check out relative to the work we're doing. And I think that's entirely fine. We can't all do everything. But it is important that we don't close that down from the outset. Because if we do, then it's not clear to me that we're really trying to engage philosophers. It seems that we're trying to talk to people with whom we already agree about the kinds of things that should be conclusions to philosophical arguments, not premises to those arguments. Now, I'm aware that when I say it's bad strategy, some people might say, well, shoot, if it's all just contingent, then how could I hold any view at all? It seems like they'd all be just different preferences. And I admit, at some level, I am saying that it's a matter of preference, whether one does analytic theology or whether one is critical of the practice of analytic theology like I am. The reason I'm critical of analytic theology is not because it is theology, but because it tends to then pass as just what philosophy of religion is and looks like. I think it's actually theology, because it's very frequently taking evidential, revelational, confessional evidence as immediately available in philosophical argument. And if that's the case, I think we should just call it theology and celebrate it and learn from it as philosophers, rather than trying to find a way to count it as philosophy from the outset. If we do that, then it seems like we're actually not making the deliberative table as robust as it could be, because we're not letting philosophers and theologians think with each other, right? But instead, we're requiring philosophers really just kind of to be the best theologians. And I actually think that's patronizing to theology, which is itself, again, a bad strategy. It cuts off partnerships that we should be able to count on. It also is bad strategy if we are really committed to truth seeking. And what I mean by this is if we allow ourselves to ask questions and recognize there are other discursive practices and communities that could be critical of the way we make sense of these questions, and especially could be critical of the answers we give to those questions, then I think we are more likely to be constantly hospitable to objections wherever they are offered, wherever they are presented from. And instead, if we start by saying philosophers are really the best theologians and theologians are really just doing philosophy if they do theology well, I then think we're not really listening to each other as discursively distinct in ways that raise new objections we might otherwise miss. To do philosophy well is not to eschew religious commitment. It might be, in fact, to constantly be open to the fact that thinking well opens on to something like confessional investment, whether that be religion or not. But it also means that we should be open and aware that confessional commitments that we hold very deeply might need rethought, might need challenged, might be responsive to critique more effectively if we aren't letting them be the foundation from which we think, but in fact, part of the nexus in which we think. So, try to summarize what I've been saying here. We've got Anselmian approaches which say there's a blurry line, it's porous between philosophy and theology because ultimately everybody starts from somewhere. So starting from one's Christian commitments or Muslim commitments or Jewish commitments or whatever, that there is no reason prima facie or before things, there is no way to start by putting certain things off the table. Start from where you find yourself, do philosophy from your commitments. That's the way we make it matter. Anything less would be biased in an inappropriate direction, and it would already skew the discourse problematically in ways that are not really responsive to the possible truth of religious claims. Again, it's a valid view. But we also could side with Aquinas and say, no, natural reason and special reason or revelation and understanding are really two different types of evidential sets. They're two different types of data. They both are important to thinking well, but we've got to be able to differentiate between them so that as philosophers, we learn from theologians, and as philosophers, we may open onto theology if the arguments take us that direction. But similarly, as philosophers, we may then end up being critical of or problematize the religious commitments that we find ourselves having and struggling to hold in light of really good objections. When we are Thomistic in this way, rather than Anselmian, this doesn't mean that we stop doing personal philosophy, but it does mean that maybe we should rethink doing philosophy confessionally. Confessional philosophy sometimes can lead to doing not much more than speaking to those who already are in the choir, instead of speaking to one's critics. Philosophers, I believe, should be distinguished by their ability to and their investment in and their celebration of the constant criticism that truth-seeking demands. Now, I believe that theologians, again, whatever religious tradition, whatever background, I think they absolutely are committed to truth-seeking, but I think that it's a truth-seeking nested in a particular kind of community of practice that looks different than the community of practice guided by argumentation and reason-giving. It's not better and worse here. It's not a superior and lesser. It's instead two different ways of engaging and living in the world. Both are important, both are essential, and both might move us further towards truth. But when we think one really just is the other, then I think we shut down the possibility of all of us moving forward more effectively, more constructively, and honestly, more hospitably and more humbly. Being humble means that we don't start with the things that we're trying to prove. We instead start with questions, and we inhabit those questions in ways that allow us to come down where the arguments lead. Sometimes they lead to places that concern us, that give us pause, that bristle against our confessional commitments. Other times they take us to places where we now need maybe to become more confessionally committed in light of the arguments themselves. But philosophy can't decide this ahead of time. It can only make these moves in the course of argument, in the practice of doing what we do. So this is why I'm a fan of the work that those doing Christian philosophy do, but I don't identify as a Christian philosopher, despite the fact that I am a philosopher and I identify as a Christian. I instead would rather be known as a philosopher committed to doing personal work that speaks to the experiential realities by which we make sense of the world, our backgrounds mattering, our embodiment informing us, and this happening in ways that then invite us deeper into the questions that might lead eventually to some sort of different, potentially religious set of commitments and way of life. In this way, I see myself as just doing good phenomenology. I'm interested in trying to figure out how is it that the world presents itself to us as experienced, as lived. And we can do that work in ways that can be engaged by, challenged by, appropriated by all other philosophers in principle. And if we start by limiting that conversation, I think we probably have, cut off the limb on which we were trying to sit, instead of inviting more people into the tree with us. Let's build a bigger treehouse, one that can have theologians and philosophers all hanging out, instead of trying to make sure that by eliminating the distinction, what we actually do is really just make a philosophical treehouse that looks a lot like religious theology, or we make a theological treehouse that really just kind of wants to pass itself off as the philosophical space. There's room for all of us at the table, and I think the table and the dinner is more exciting when all of us get to speak from where we are, rather than assuming that the right place to start is an exclusivist commitment to views that in fact probably should be challenged in the course of the dinner conversation itself. All right. So maybe we'll come back to this in future months and take off some side shoots, think a little bit about maybe how continental philosophy has spoken into this debate. I didn't touch on the theological turn of French phenomenology, a big idea that maybe would be interesting. That's what I do most of my research on, and I reject that it's a theological turn. I think it's just good philosophy of religion. So let me know. Send me emails, contact@jaaaronsimmons.com. That's where I'll get your emails. Make sure to post comments on this video. Let me know if you've got ideas or thoughts or objections or critiques even to the way that I've laid it out here. This is not the only way to understand things. It is, however, a helpful one, a historical one, and one that I think is particularly robust for moving us forward in pretty good ways. As always, think with me as I think with you. Thank you so much for joining me on this adventure in public philosophy. I hope if you have not yet subscribed to the YouTube channel Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, please get subscribed there. These videos that I put on the newsletter are private, so it's only available for you. But I do weekly videos, at least, sometimes more than one a week, that are made publicly available. And I hope that you will help me spread the word about this work so we can build this community together. Again, please reach out. Contact me. I love hearing suggestions, ideas, and encouragement to do this in ways that maybe speak to where you find yourself so that we can all move forward together. All right. Have an amazing March 2023, and I hope to see you in April, unless a piano falls on our heads. Thanks again.